Welcome to our deep dive, everybody.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be talking about inherited family trauma.
Oh, cool.
It's basically how, the experiences of our ancestors can actually affect us today.
Oh, wow.
We'll be looking at It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wolynn.
Okay.
So by the end of this deep dive, you'll understand how trauma echoes through families, and we'll give you some tools to recognize if it's playing a role in your own life.
So it's really interesting. We used to just think about trauma as this individual experience, but now we're kind of seeing how, events from previous generations can have a real impact.
Right.
Even if those events, weren't even talked about as a hidden script.
Yeah, that hidden script idea is so interesting.
Right.
In the book, the author opens with this story about Jesse, who had really bad insomnia.
Okay.
He was terrified of falling asleep.
Oh, wow.
And it turned out that this fear was linked to his uncle, who died from hypothermia 30 years earlier.
Oh.
Something that Jesse didn't even know about.
Yeah.
So what's going on there?
Well, it shows how trauma can get embedded in our system,
Yeah.
showing up as these fears or anxieties.
Right.
It's not even really about the event itself, but the unresolved emotional response
Right.
that sort of gets passed down.
Wow.
So think of it this way, if your ancestors experienced something traumatic,
Right.
their nervous system went into fight, flight, or freeze.
Right. Yeah.
And sometimes those responses can get inherited,
Really?
leading to similar reactions in later generations,
Wow.
even if they don't even know about the original event.
So it's almost like we inherit that baggage.
Yeah, exactly. And because it's unconscious, we might not even understand why we're, reacting certain ways.
Yeah.
We might have these phobias or weird relationship patterns,
Right.
or even physical symptoms that don't have a logical explanation.
That's wild.
Yeah.
The book talks about epigenetics as one of the mechanisms for this.
Yeah.
It says that trauma can actually leave these tags on our DNA, which affect how our genes are expressed. You might be familiar with the Dutch hunger-winter study,
Oh, yeah.
where children born to mothers who experienced famine during pregnancy had a higher risk of health problems later.
Right.
So could you maybe explain this idea of epigenetics a bit more?
So, imagine your DNA as a book, right?
Okay, yeah.
Epigenetics are the bookmarks. They highlight which pages are read.
Okay.
Trauma can add or remove these bookmarks,
Wow.
impacting how your genes are expressed. So your DNA sequence stays the same, but experiences can alter which genes are turned on or off.
Oh, wow.
And those changes can be passed down.
That's wild. Makes you wonder if what other bookmarks are in there, huh?
It really does. And it makes you realize how important it is to understand not just our own experiences, but the experiences of those who came before us.
Right.
Their struggles can literally become part of us.
Yeah, that's powerful. And it leads us to this other concept from the book, the idea of core language.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is?
So think of core language as this secret code
Okay.
embedded in our words, revealing the unresolved emotional wounds from our family history.
Right.
So it's those emotionally charged words and phrases we use that reflect, our deepest fears and our unmet needs. It's
Yeah.
a window into our unconscious, right?
Did you give an example?
Yeah. So the book talks about Gretchen, who had this intense fear of vaporizing.
Vaporizing.
It turned out that this fear was connected to her grandmother's experience in the Holocaust.
Wow.
Even though Gretchen had never been told about her grandmother's trauma, the fear was passed down, and it showed up in her language and behavior.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So how do these fears and anxieties connect back to specific events in our family history? The book talks about these 4 unconscious themes.
Right.
What are those?
So those are basically about how we unconsciously relate to our family in the world. So
Wow.
we have merging with a parent, rejecting a parent,
Okay.
a break in the early bond with mother, and identifying with another family member.
Right.
And these themes kind of operate beneath the surface.
Yeah.
And they can shape our behaviors, relationships, and even the words we use.
Interesting.
So for example, someone who unconsciously identifies with a grandparent who struggled with poverty might find themselves sabotaging their own like financial success.
Wow.
You know?
So we're not just inheriting like, physical traits,
Right.
but also these emotional patterns.
Yeah, exactly.
And words of relating to the world.
Yeah, and these patterns often play out in that core language we were talking about.
Right.
Like the words we use to describe ourselves, our relationships, and, just our experiences.
Yeah. This makes me think about how we're like unknowingly carrying the burdens of our ancestors.
Yeah.
How can we start to identify our own core language?
Good question.
Does the book give any guidance on that?
It does, yeah. Wolynn suggests focusing on 3 key elements.
Okay.
First, identify your core complaint.
Mm-hmm.
What's the biggest issue you're facing right now?
Okay.
What do you really want to heal?
Okay. So that's the core complaint. What are the other 2?
So the next one is your core descriptors.
Okay.
These are the adjectives that come to mind when you describe your mother and your father.
Right.
What do you blame them for? What qualities stand out?
Right.
Even if they're negative.
Okay.
And then finally, try to articulate your core sentence.
Okay.
What's your absolute worst fear?
Got it. That's helpful.
Yeah.
And once we've identified our core language,
Yeah.
how do we connect it back to that traumatic event in our family history?
Right. That's where a genogram comes in.
Okay.
It's essentially a family tree, but you map out family relationships and any significant traumas or difficult fates that might have occurred.
Right.
So this visual representation can help you identify the core trauma, which is that specific unresolved event that connects to your core language.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. The unspoken trauma, the core language, the genogram.
Yeah.
It's like we're piecing together a puzzle of our own lives.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And as we go deeper into this concept of inherited family trauma, we'll explore how to actually use these tools to understand our own stories.
Right.
And then ultimately break free from those patterns that are holding us back. Yeah.
So we've been kind of mapping out this idea of a hidden script running in our lives, passed down through generations.
Yeah.
And it's incredible how these unconscious patterns rooted in trauma can influence our thoughts, our behaviors, even our physical health.
Yeah. What's fascinating is that recognizing these patterns is actually the first step towards breaking free.
Right.
It's not about blaming our ancestors or anything.
Right.
But understanding where these struggles are coming from, and then we can rewrite the script.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's about reclaiming our power, right?
Exactly.
In that spirit, the book delves into something called blind love.
Yeah.
It's how these unconscious loyalties and unresolved trauma from our families can actually impact our romantic relationships.
Right.
It's almost like we're drawn to partners who fit the mold of those unresolved dynamics.
Yeah, exactly. Think about it. We learn about relationships from our families, right?
Yeah.
So if those relationships were marked by trauma,
Right.
we might unconsciously seek out similar dynamics in our own romantic partnerships.
Oh, wow.
Even if those dynamics are harmful,
Yeah.
Yeah.
The book is an example of Dan and Nancy, a couple that was constantly fighting.
Right.
Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. So Dan felt that Nancy was too needy and demanding, while Nancy felt neglected and emotionally abandoned by Dan.
Right.
And their dynamic was actually rooted in their childhoods.
Okay.
Dan's mother had been extremely demanding and emotionally volatile,
Wow.
while Nancy's mother had been emotionally distant and unavailable.
So they were both unconsciously reenacting the dynamics of their childhoods in their marriage.
Exactly. Yeah. And once they understood this connection, they were able to start communicating more effectively,
Wow.
setting healthier boundaries and meeting each other's needs in a more conscious way.
Right.
In a more compassionate way.
That's a powerful example of how, recognizing those patterns can lead to real change
Right.
in our relationships.
For sure.
But what about those more fragmented memories,
Yeah.
like those nonverbal memories that accompany trauma? How do we even begin to access those?
That's where body-centered practices can be really crucial. The book emphasizes, tuning into our physical sensations because they often hold the key to unlocking these undeclared memories.
Earlier, you mentioned that trauma can add these bookmarks to our DNA,
Right.
affecting how our genes are expressed.
Yeah.
Could these bookmarks also affect how trauma is stored in the body.
It's certainly possible. We know that trauma can impact, our nervous system, hormone levels, even the structure of our brains.
Right.
And these changes can create these like physical and emotional patterns that, linger long after the traumatic event has passed.
The book is the example of Jennifer, who suffered from like panic attacks that were linked to the sudden death of her father.
Right.
When she was really young, just a toddler.
Yeah, she was too young to really process the event, verbally.
Right.
But those feelings of like fear and helplessness and abandonment, those were stored in her body, and years later they would get triggered.
Wow.
Leading to panic attacks.
That's heartbreaking, but it also shows how resilient we are, right? Like even with that early trauma, there's a part of us that wants to like heal and make sense of it.
Absolutely. And that's where the book offers hope,
Right.
It gives us like practical guidance.
Right.
It suggests using techniques like mindful breathing, grounding exercises.
Yeah.
You can even gently like place your hand on the area where you feel the sensations during a panic attack.
Wow.
Or a flashback,
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging and comforting those like younger parts of ourselves that are still holding on to the trauma.
This reminds me of what you were saying about, blind love. How we unconsciously might seek out partners who fit the mold of our unresolved family dynamics.
Right.
Is there a connection between these like early childhood experiences and our relationship patterns as adults?
Oh, there's definitely a connection. Yeah. Early childhood experiences, especially, our relationship with our primary caregiver,
Right.
really shape our attachment style, how we relate to others in intimate relationships.
Right.
So if those early experiences were marked by, trauma or separation,
Right. Yeah.
we might develop these insecure attachment patterns leading to, anxiety, fear of abandonment, or even just difficulty trusting others.
The book also talks about the importance of recognizing the metaphorical language of our symptoms.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So our symptoms often hold like symbolic meaning, They're not just random. They're actually trying to communicate something to, for instance, someone who's like carrying the burden of their family secrets might develop chronic back pain.
Right.
Symbolizing the weight they're carrying.
Wow. So by paying attention to our symptoms and like trying to understand their deeper meaning, we can gain like insights into the underlying trauma.
Exactly. It's like learning to speak the language of our bodies.
Right.
The book has a fascinating example of Kelly, who struggled with trichotillomania.
Oh, wow.
Which is like compulsive hair pulling.
Right.
And it turned out to be connected to an early separation from her mother when she was like a toddler.
It makes you think about how much we express through our bodies, even without realizing it.
Yeah, totally.
Could you tell us a little bit more about Kelly's story?
Yeah. So Kelly would experience like intense waves of anxiety every evening around 9 p.m.
Oh, wow.
And the only way she could find relief was by pulling out her hair.
Wow.
And she had undergone surgery when she was about 18 months old.
Okay.
And she had to stay in the hospital for 10 days. Okay, and each evening around 9 p.m., her mom would leave to go home and care for Kelly's siblings.
Right.
So this like necessary separation, even though brief, created this like deep-seated fear of abandonment in Kelly.
Wow.
Which manifested as the hair pulling ritual.
It's like her body was remembering that separation and reacting to it.
Yeah.
Even though her conscious mind didn't have like a clear memory of the event.
Exactly. In Kelly's case, the hair pulling itself was like a metaphor for the separation she had experienced.
Right.
Hair is meant to be connected to the scalp.
Right.
And it was being like forcibly removed, just as she had been separated from her source of security.
Yeah, that's really insightful.
It makes you wonder, like, how many other unexplained symptoms or behaviors might be rooted in this kind of like unconscious memory?
It really does. And that's why this exploration of, inherited family trauma is so important.
Yeah, for sure.
It's about like shining a light on these hidden patterns and understanding how they're impacting our lives.
Yeah.
This leads us to the idea of the genogram, which we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Could you remind us what that is and how it can help us understand like our inherited trauma?
Yeah, so a genogram is essentially a family tree that maps out not just, names and dates, but also like significant traumas and difficult fates that might have occurred within a family lineage. So it's a visual tool for like identifying patterns and connections that might not be apparent otherwise.
you mentioned earlier that the genogram can help us identify that, like core trauma, the specific unresolved event in our family history that's connected to our, current struggles.
Right.
The book gives the example of Ellie, who was terrified of going crazy.
Right.
Could you share her story with us?
Yeah. So Ellie's fear was so intense. It was affecting her daily life. She couldn't sleep, couldn't focus at work, and was just constantly on edge. And through constructing a genogram, she discovered that her great-grandmother had been institutionalized for mental illness.
Wow.
And her own mother suffered from postpartum depression.
So even though Ellie hadn't personally experienced those events, she was carrying the legacy of her family's struggle with mental health.
Exactly. And once she, understood this connection, she could start to separate her own experience from that of her ancestors.
Wow.
It was a profound realization for her. She realized that she didn't have to inherit their fate.
Right.
She could choose a different path.
That's so empowering. It speaks to the idea that we actually have the power to break free from these inherited patterns.
Yeah.
But it also brings up the question of societal and cultural factors.
Right.
How do larger societal issues contribute to this inherited family trauma?
That's an essential point. Yeah. The book highlights how societal issues like war, poverty, discrimination, even historical events like the Holocaust can create these ripples of trauma that can affect generations, For instance, the book shares the story of Prak, an 8-year-old Cambodian boy who kept hurting himself by hitting his head.
Oh, wow. What was going on with Prak?
So Prak had never met his grandfather, who had been brutally murdered by the Khmer Rouge during the Cambodian genocide.
Wow.
And even though Prak hadn't directly experienced this trauma, he was carrying the legacy of his family's pain.
So even though he wasn't alive during the genocide, he was still inheriting its effects.
Exactly, yeah. And this underscores the importance of understanding the larger historical and cultural context when we're exploring this.
Right.
It's not just about individual families, It's about recognizing how these larger societal forces can create wounds that can be passed down.
Yeah, this brings up a question for me. The book emphasizes that, recognizing inherited family trauma is not about blaming our parents.
Right.
Or our ancestors, right?
Yeah.
It's about understanding the roots of our patterns so we can break free.
Right.
But when we start looking at these, larger societal issues like war and discrimination, how do we avoid falling into the trap of blame?
It's a valid concern, yeah. When we're talking about societal issues, it's crucial to acknowledge the systemic injustices that have created and perpetuated the trauma, without necessarily assigning blame to individuals. It's about recognizing that we're all part of a larger system and we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world.
So it's about shifting our focus from blame to responsibility.
Yes.
Recognizing that we have a responsibility to understand these historical wounds and to work towards healing them, both individually and collectively.
Exactly, yeah. It's about moving from a place of judgment to a place of understanding and compassion.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, and healing for one person can contribute to healing for all.
Earlier we were talking about, blind love and how unresolved trauma can play out in our romantic relationships.
Right.
But what about our relationship with success?
Right.
The book mentions that unresolved trauma can also impact our ability to, achieve our goals.
Absolutely, yeah. It can manifest as self-sabotage, fear of failure, or just difficulty achieving our goals, The book suggests exploring whether we might be unconsciously loyal to someone in our family who struggled with success. Right. Or if we're trying to balance out a perceived injustice from the past.
Right. You mentioned a lawyer named Ben who kept experiencing financial setbacks.
Oh, yeah.
Even though he was brilliant and hardworking.
Right.
Could you tell us more about his story?
So Ben's grandfather had built his fortune by exploiting migrant workers.
Oh, wow.
Paying them unfair wages, giving them substandard living conditions.
Right.
And even though Ben's father eventually inherited the wealth, he lost it all. And Ben, in a subconscious attempt to balance out the family karma, struggling to achieve financial stability,
So by acknowledging this pattern and like taking steps to make amends for his family's past actions, he was able to break free from this like cycle of financial struggle.
Exactly. He realized that his struggles weren't just about his own individual efforts, but were also influenced by like these unseen forces from his family history. So he started by educating himself about the experiences of migrant workers, and then he actually got involved in organizations that were like advocating for their rights.
Wow, that's great.
And as he took action to, repair the harm that had been done, he started to experience more abundance and flow in his own life.
That's such a powerful example of how healing from, inherited family trauma can involve like taking action in the world.
Right.
It's not just about inner work, but also about addressing these external factors.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about recognizing that we're not just individuals, but we're also part of a larger web of relationships and systems.
Right.
And healing often involves like taking action to restore balance and harmony to those systems.
So we've been talking about how this unresolved trauma that's like passed down through generations can impact our lives in such profound ways, from our relationships and success to even our physical health.
Yeah.
But the book doesn't just leave us with this awareness. It actually gives us a path forward.
Right.
Tools for healing and transformation.
It is empowering to realize that, we're not just passive recipients of this inherited trauma.
Right.
We can heal. We can rewrite the script like we were talking about and create a better future for ourselves.
The book highlights several strategies for healing, like healing sentences.
Yeah.
These personalized affirmations that can help us shift our internal experience.
Right.
Can you give an example of a healing sentence?
Yeah. So let's say someone's struggling with a fear of abandonment. Maybe it stems from a parent who was emotionally unavailable.
Right.
A healing sentence could be something like, even though you weren't there for me emotionally, Mom, I choose to give myself the love and support I need.
Wow.
It acknowledges that past pain, but also declares a new way of being.
That's powerful. It's about like taking back our power.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Not letting the past control our present or future.
And it's not about like denying or minimizing the trauma.
Right.
But transforming our relationship to it, moving from victimhood to agency.
Yeah. The book also emphasizes the importance of rituals and practices for healing.
Right.
What are some examples of those?
Oh, there are so many. Visualization, for instance,
Okay.
can help us create new neural pathways and access a deeper sense of peace.
Yeah.
Like imagine sending love and healing energy to those who came before you,
Okay.
releasing the burdens they carried.
That sounds really soothing. What are some other practices we could try?
Journaling can be a really powerful way to process those emotions and gain clarity. Try like writing a letter to an ancestor who experienced trauma.
Okay.
Expressing empathy and gratitude for their strength.
Right.
Or you could explore creative expression through art, music, or dance.
Right.
Just allowing those unspoken emotions to flow through you.
Yeah, it's like we're giving a voice to those silenced experiences.
Right.
Within ourselves and in our lineage.
And as we do that, we create space for healing, not just for us, but for generations to come.
This brings us to the importance of addressing like the societal and cultural factors that contribute to inherited family trauma.
Right.
You mentioned earlier the impact of, events like war, discrimination. How do we even begin to heal these larger societal wounds?
It starts with awareness.
Okay.
Acknowledging those injustices of the past and their impact on individuals and communities.
Right.
It's about educating ourselves about the history of trauma and oppression, listening to the stories of those who have been marginalized, challenging the systems that perpetuate these patterns.
It sounds like it's about creating a more just and equitable world.
Yeah.
Where trauma isn't passed down through generations.
Exactly. It's about breaking that cycle, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. And we all have a role to play in that.
Yeah.
We can choose to respond to those echoes of the past with compassion, understanding, and a commitment to healing.
This deep dive has been truly eye-opening.
Yeah.
We've explored the hidden world of inherited family trauma, how it impacts our lives.
Right.
And most importantly, how we can break free from these patterns.
Yes.
Create a more empowered present and future.
It's been great talking about this with you.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation.
And remember, like, you're not alone on this path. There's support available and healing is possible.
If you're intrigued by what we've talked about today, I highly recommend checking out the full book, It Didn't Start With You.
Yeah, it's a great book.
It's packed with incredible stories, insights, and practical tools for healing.
And remember, as you embark on this journey of healing, be gentle with yourself. It takes time, patience, and compassion.
Right.
But you have the power to transform your life and create a legacy of healing for generations to come.
Until next time, keep diving deep and discovering the hidden forces that shape who you are.